dive right into our first gospel series. So as you all know, we've been going through the Old Testament. This year we're nearing the end of our journey. Not that we've covered everything, but that we're kind of hitting a lot of the major highlights. And the idea behind this first gospel series is to call out the good news in the Old Testament, to call out the things that point to Jesus and that point to who God is actually. You know, I think often we divide the testaments up and we like the new one and we don't like the old one so much. As a matter of fact, we go so far as to call it the old one, as if it's no longer relevant or it doesn't matter anymore. But in fact, God is the same in both. It's from the beginning of time, He has been working the same goodness into creation. The same goodness that He used to establish everything that is, He is still working back into the world. And that's the story that Jesus continued. Not that Jesus started, but that Jesus continued when He showed up in the flesh. So we want to go through the Old Testament and teach it that way because I've over the years have heard, and probably even myself taught the Old Testament in a very specific way that I don't think is terribly helpful. You know, we teach it as like a bunch of these moral stories. You know, it's almost like fables. There are these disconnected stories, and the moral of the story is to be brave like David when he faced the giant, you know, or to not give in to temptation like David when he's standing on the roof, or, you know, so on and so forth. We look at these stories and we say, so the moral is ... But when you teach the Old Testament that way, it just feels like something's missing, you know? Because even the good stories, they don't stay good. You know, you'll have a story, especially we notice this in the stories of the kings. You'll have a story of Jehoshaphat, this story of this great victory, this man who was faithful, and he chose to send the worshipers into battle ahead of the armies and make that a statement of who God was and his confidence in God's character and in his strength to fight for them. And that's awesome, and we read that story and we're like, be like him. But then the next generation, the next king has forgotten who God is, and the whole thing just kind of spirals out of control. And more often than not, as a matter of fact, I see that hand, Don.
I heard someone say he doesn't call it the Old Testament, he calls it the First Testament.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they're both old.
Fair enough. Anyway, if we look at it as these kind of moral stories, the morals don't ever last, and it leaves you feeling a little bit like disappointed. You know, it's the stories of the Judges. Judges is the classic example of this. High point moment where God rescues His people, and within a generation they've forgotten and they're worse off than they were before. And the story just spirals like this. And I felt the same way when we read the prophets. You know, the prophets talk a lot about sin and consequence. We talked last week about how the prophets, we're specifically talking about Isaiah these last couple of weeks, will not so much focus on the future. That's what we tend to think prophecy is. It's focusing on the future. But really what they're talking about is the past. They're talking about the moment when God made a covenant with His people at Mount Sinai. That's what most of the prophets are talking about. And they're saying, remember that moment. Remember who God is. Remember who we are. Remember what we committed to do, and then do it. And if we would just do it, then all the stuff that I see coming down the horizon, all this future stuff that we can predict is going to happen, won't happen. If we would just repent. You know, repent means to turn around and head the other direction. It means you're going on. This is the prophet's basic message. There's a cliff coming up. Everybody can see it. Just turn around. I mean, Isaiah has the benefit of watching it happen to the north of him. You know, he's ministering in the southern kingdom of Judah, watching all this happen in the north. Their idolatry, their injustice is causing them to become victim to the Assyrians. They're watching it happen, and he's saying, turn around. The same thing is about to happen here that's happening up there right now if we don't change our ways. And when you read the stories of the prophets that way, it's powerful, but it's also kind of this like, I mean, I hesitate to say it like this, but almost this cliche thing, like sin has consequences, you know? And if we continue on this path, we're going to end up in a bad spot, and that just is what it is. And that's a true message that the Bible has for us. But again, it just leaves you feeling like there has to be a little bit more than this. The whole Old Testament kind of feels that way to me sometimes, especially the prophets. Like, are you trying to tell us something more? Or is it just, if you keep on going this way, bad stuff's going to happen. If you turn around, you'll enter into prosperity and blessing. Is that really all there is? Because if that is all there is, then this whole thing we're doing here is sort of, it's kind of like karma. Yeah? Keep doing that bad stuff, and bad stuff's going to happen to you. Was that TV show, My Name is Earl? Am I dating myself here? Yeah. Do bad things happen. Do good things, and you'll have a better life, right? If that's the whole of the message. We read the story of David, and it's like, be like David. Be brave. You'll love it. Your life will be better that way. Don't be like David. Don't give in to temptation. Don't go that way. Go this way. If that's all it is, then it's what we call moral therapeutic deism. Okay? In other words, it's moralism with kind of a veneer or a layer of God thrown over the top of it to make us feel better about the lives that we're living. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with morality. God built it into the universe. The reason that there are consequences to sin is because God made a moral law into the universe. The same way he made physical laws, there's moral law. When we sin, he's not actively punishing us. We're just facing the consequences of our choices. You guys have heard me say this before. If I jump off a cliff and I fall to my death, I am not being punished by gravity. That's just what happens. If I continue down a path of sin and injustice and treating people badly and whatever else, then when my life is falling apart, I don't get to look at God and say, why are you punishing me? He's kind of saying, because you're violating the way that I built you. You're going against design. You're going against programming of the universe. And that's a good message. Like, that'll preach. That's what a pastor would say. That'll preach. But again, if that's all there is, I'm kind of thinking, man, this is just, it feels a little futile, It feels a little bit like, all right, let's just try harder this week, guys. Good luck. Good luck out there being a better person, turning your life around. Let's not make those same choices again. Let's go this way. But the truth is, that's not all the Old Testament is. We have seen time and time again how it's pointing towards something. How there are these gaps or these holes that if you dig into them a little bit, especially with the benefit of the New Testament in our back pockets, you dig into them a little bit, you realize that there's a person who fills these holes. That there's a person that changes the system, that breaks the cycles and creates something altogether new. That there's somebody who can get us out of just try harder, but can actually transform our hearts. And when you see him, he changes everything for us. And he pops up over and over again, especially in the prophets. And it's really bizarre when you read it, because you'll see it in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah will be talking about, hey, this is happening in the north. Idolatry is causing all of this. Injustice is causing all of this. Destruction is coming on us. It's getting heavy, like this heavy talk of judgment. And then out of nowhere, this passage, like Isaiah 9, unto us a son is born. Unto us a child is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, the everlasting, Mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the greatness and increase of his government and peace, there will be no end. It's this like, out of nowhere, you're like, whoa, wait a minute. What just happened? I was heading toward this path of doom and gloom, this path of destruction as a result of my own choices. And then somebody entered into the story and changed it. Everything shifted in just a moment. And then it happens again in Isaiah 11, and it happens again in Isaiah 42, and it happens again in Isaiah 53. And we see this character that I'm not even sure Isaiah really understood what was going on. I think these were true prophetic moments where he's just writing or he's just speaking, and out of his mouth suddenly are words coming from God. That's what, if you read about the prophets, it said they spoke from God. It's almost like God is just downloading into him, and he becomes for a moment this vessel as God just speaks. Here's what I'm going to do about it. I'm not going to leave you in this cycle forever. This cycle of trying and failing. This cycle of harming and hurting, of idolatry and injustice and brokenness, but I'm going to change the game. I'm going to show up myself. We call these messianic prophecies. Prophecies about Jesus. And almost all, if not all of the Old Testament prophets, major and minor, have them. And tonight we're going to talk about Isaiah's messianic prophecies. I just mentioned the first one, the famous, we call it the Christmas prophecy, right? That's all I'm going to say about that one. But I want to dive in with 3 different prophecies, each one layering on each other to give us a clearer picture of this person who's coming, okay? So the first one, let's just dive in. It's Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. It says this, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, and from his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. I think that's such an interesting sentence, don't you? He will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. The wolf will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf, and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear, their young will lie down together. The lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den. The young child will put his hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the seas. So here we have this doom and gloom prophecy. Isaiah is getting darker and darker and heavier, and then out of nowhere, somebody's going to show up. He's called here the shoot of the stump of Jesse. Now, who's Jesse? Y'all remember? David's dad. Okay? Now, David is the promised king. He's the one that God said, I'm going to make you the eternal king of my people. Somebody from your line will sit on the throne of Israel in perpetuity. Right? Remember, David says to God in this great moment of faith, David stands up, this man of faith, and says, Lord, I want to build you a house, a temple. And God says, I'm going to build you a house. You're not going to be the one to build me a house. Somebody else will do that. But I'm going to build you a house or a dynasty. I'm going to make your name great, and I'm going to bless you, and one of your descendants will sit on the throne of Israel. Well, if you read the story of the prophets, what the prophets are warning about is these descendants of David, most of them are pretty lousy kings that have led God's people into apostasy and idolatry and injustice and all kinds of brokenness. And as a result, there is an axe that is lay at the root of the tree, getting ready to chop the whole thing down. The whole thing is corrupt, God says, so it's going to go. The whole dynasty, the whole kingdom is going to fall. And we'll see it, not in Isaiah's lifetime, but later. The Babylonians will come. They will conquer Jerusalem. They will destroy the temple. They will haul the people off into exile. Bam, the line of David cut. But Isaiah here says something fascinating. He says, out of the stump of Jesse. Isn't that a vivid picture? If you ever wandered through the wilderness and you've seen a stump of a tree that's been cut down, and then there's like a branch with a couple leaves growing out of it. That's what he says. A branch from the stump of Jesse will grow. And notice what he says. It's going to bear fruit. I love the way Isaiah talks about Jesus. We're going to get into this more in the next prophecy here in just a second, but so simple and understated. A branch growing out of a stump that will bear fruit if you give it time. He says the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. So he's going to be anointed just like the prophets of old. In other words, he's saying the stuff that we've seen in this book so far, the Spirit of God will rest on him, and he will do these things and greater. He's not just going to be anointed with oil like the kings that you've seen. He'll be a different kind of a king, anointed by the presence of God. He's going to have wisdom and understanding, counsel and might. Like I said, I pointed out that verse. I don't know what to do with it, but it says he will delight in the fear of the Lord. In other words, being in a place of awe, overwhelmed by the presence of God, will be his heart's desire. That's going to be what he wants. And he goes on to say, because he's anointed by the Spirit of God, he's going to judge the world with justice. And notice what justice looks like here. This is an aside. But justice here looks like preferential treatment for the underprivileged. Okay, this is an aside. If we had time, we would go to Isaiah 58 and talk about this more, but I want to take 2 minutes here to point out that we in the West tend to think of justice as what we call retributive justice. So when someone has done something wrong, justice means we punish the person who's done something wrong in order to set the scales back to right. That's when we think of the justice system, that's what we're thinking of most of the time. In the Old Testament, that's 10% of the time. 10% of the time, the word justice means retributive. 90% of the time, the word justice means fairness. It means there's whenever human society becomes idolatrous, whenever we turn our eyes away from God and choose other things, what happens is the scales get tipped, and inevitably we have a group of haves and a group of have-nots. That's how sin structures us. It makes us elevate ourselves above other people by putting other people down. And whenever that happens, God is against it. God routinely and regularly shows in the Old Testament and in the New Testament preferential treatment for the underprivileged, because the way he designed the world was that there's always enough for everybody. And if we just looked to him, that would be true. I mean, that's reality. If we just looked at who God is, fixed our eyes on him, dedicated our hearts to him, threw down the idols that we tend to worship, and just did what he told us to do, there would be enough for everybody. That's what happened in the New Testament church. Whenever the church is really on fire, that's what happens. One of the indicators that the church is on fire is that the poor are cared for. And the Bible calls that justice, not retributive, but restorative justice, where we are setting the world back to shalom. And God says, when the branch grows out of the stump of Jesse, he will, notice, judge with righteousness, he will judge the needy. With justice, he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. Sometime, maybe when we get to Christmas, we'll do this. We'll look at the Gospel of Luke and see how the angels and Mary and Elizabeth and John the Baptist all talk about Jesus. It's always in the context of good news for the poor. He's come to set the scales back to right again, to make sure that there's always enough for everybody. And notice what comes next. He is then going to strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he'll slay the wicked. In other words, the judgment for the poor means that there has to be an accounting for those who have made them poor, who have made them oppressed and put them down. And here we have Jesus coming in to judge the wicked. It says he's going to strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. He's going to slay the wicked with the breath from his lips. And all of us who grew up in the Western world stand up and cheer, because here he is. Here's the really manly Jesus coming in with the rod and slaying people. And anybody who's kind of grown up in the Western church gets really excited about this Jesus. You have to pay attention to what it says here. It does not say that he will strike the earth with the rod of his hand. It does not say he will slay the wicked with a sword or with his armies. What does it say? Both times. With the rod of his mouth. He will slay the wicked with the breath from his lips. This is very in keeping with the prophecies about Jesus. We actually see it in the book of Revelation too. Jesus shows up in Revelation 19, riding a white horse, covered in blood. He's got a sword with which he will slay the earth, slay the wicked of the earth. And we as Westerners get so excited about this violent Jesus because he's finally come to judge the wicked and to pass judgment and condemnation on those who have opposed him. But again, in Revelation, the sword is coming out of his mouth. What does that mean? That means that the way Jesus strikes the earth is with his words. The way he slays the wicked is with conviction, with truth. This is not a violent Jesus coming to show up to wreak destruction on the earth. This is a Jesus who comes and speaks truth. And his truth cuts us to the heart. His truth reveals our inner character. His truth lays bare our souls before his eyes. That's how he changes us. And this is a message I think we need to hear in the Western church, because I'm frankly more and more disturbed by the language of war and battle and army that I've heard creeping into Western Christianity. We speak like we're fighting a battle against people, against enemies that are going to be destroyed. We speak destruction against our enemies. We speak condemnation against our enemies, and Jesus doesn't do that. He's not inciting violence in any way. He's bringing conviction through the things he says. I think it's really important. I frankly, and if you ever catch me doing this, you're welcome to call me out on it. I frankly don't want to use language, even though the Bible does from time to time, of battle or fighting or armies or onward Christian soldiers or anything else in this place. I don't. Because as much as I think there is a good message behind a lot of those things, we are fighting not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. There's truth there, and life is sometimes a battle. I think sometimes in our minds, the way that we're shaped by the world, we tend to look at our enemies as people created in the image of God. And we pronounce wrath and destruction and violence and whatever else over them, and we can't, because our King doesn't. He comes to bring conviction with the words of his mouth, the rod of his mouth, the breath from his lips. And then it says, as he does this, as he elevates the poor and speaks conviction against the wicked, he will bring about, by the Spirit of the Lord, a return to the Garden of Eden. Did you guys notice that? I mean, the most poetic and powerful of language. The wolf will lay down with a lamb. A little kid's going to stick his hand into a cobra's nest and play with the cobras. I mean, it's this poetic and vivid picture of creation restored, the way it was supposed to be. I mean, imagine living in this world without fear. That's how it was supposed to be. And all of it because he will bring back the knowledge of God. The entire earth will be filled with the knowledge of God like water covers the seas. That's what he's going to do. That's God's solution to the problem, to the cycles of idolatry and injustice. That's how he's going to fix it. Somebody's going to show up. He's going to teach us who God is, what he's like. And as we look at him, as we are filled with the same Spirit that fills him, as he breathes his anointing onto us, Eden will be restored in us, slowly but surely, and then through us to the whole world. That's how it's going to work. And it's all focused on this character, this shoot from the stump of Jesse. Next passage, Isaiah 42. Here's my servant, whom I delight, my chosen one, whom I delight. I will put my Spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged until he establishes justice on earth. In his teaching the islands will put their hope. This is what the Lord says, the creator of the heavens, who stretches them out, who spreads out the earth with all that springs from it, who gives breath to its people and life to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand, and I will keep you and make you to be a covenant for the people, a light for the Gentiles, to open the eyes that are blind, to free the captives from prison, and to release from the dungeons those who sit in darkness. Beautiful passage. It's the beginning of something we call the servant songs in Isaiah. It's talking about his servant who's showing up to do the will of his Father. And notice some of the same themes. He's going to bring justice. He's going to judge the earth. He's going to establish peace and wholeness for all those who are broken. But notice what it says. He's going to do it quietly. Did you guys notice that? It says he's not going to shout or cry out in the streets. In other words, I just want to be clear on this. He is going to strike the earth with the rod of his mouth and slay the wicked with the breath from his lips without ever yelling, without ever raising his voice. Man, don't you wish that our leaders were more like that? I'm talking all of them, on all sides of the political spectrum. Don't you wish that that's what our world looked like today? Is instead of trying to shout each other down, we followed the example of Jesus and we were meek and humble. That doesn't mean we back down from truth. It doesn't mean that we have to compromise. But he didn't have to yell. He didn't have to name call. He didn't have to villainize or demonize. He didn't have to make his words weapons. The truth does that naturally. The truth cuts naturally. He's quiet and gentle. it says that he could walk through a field without breaking a bruised reed. It's an interesting picture, isn't it? Isaiah is so poetic. There's a reed in the field that's already been bent by the wind or maybe by a passing animal. It's already bent a little bit, and so it could just topple over if you brushed it the wrong way. And he's going to move through the field so gently that it's not even damaged in his passing. As a matter of fact, the way you will know he was in the field was not by the destruction that he caused, but by the restoration that he brings to the field. It says, a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. Okay, so you have this picture of a candle that's just sputtering, that's just about to go out. And he speaks to it so lightly that it doesn't even snuff it out. He didn't try to draw attention to himself for the sake of attention. He didn't seek power. He didn't run for office or lead an army. He didn't conquer or torture or kill or oppress. He didn't gossip. He didn't villainize. He didn't demonize. He didn't hate. He didn't do any of the things by which we try to gain power over another person, and yet he will bring justice to the nations. That's how you change the world, quietly, gently. I heard somebody once say, the Christian message, the way that Christians transform the world is by 1,000 quiet kindnesses. Not from the top down, not with armies, not with bold promises that we don't intend to keep, but 1,000 quiet kindnesses. And this is what our King looks like. This is how justice is done, and I don't think anybody actually buys it anymore. You know, I remember several years ago, you guys have heard me tell this story. I was listening to a pastor talk about how he was getting ready to vote in an upcoming election. And somebody said, the interviewer said to him, well, how much does the example of Jesus factor into your voting? Like, do you want somebody who looks like Jesus to be your next president? And he said, he said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. He said, Jesus is great for church. But for the running of a nation, you need somebody who's bold and strong. And I was shocked. And the truth is, I've heard that sentiment not just on one side, but on both sides of the political argument. We think that Jesus is just a good moral teacher, that he's just about making people nicer to each other. But if we take the message of Isaiah seriously, it says he is the only one who knows how to bring justice to the nations. And that if we follow his example, really, truly, sacrificially, boldly, that's exactly what he'll do. It's when we try to wrest power from his hands and do it our way that we find ourselves in the problems that we have. This message here should probably cause us to rethink just about everything that we think about power and influence. I love how it says, the islands will put their hope in him. Don't you like that? I know that most of us, when we hear that, we're thinking about Hawaii. But who's he talking about when he's talking about the islands? Us. In their worldview, the islands were what was out there in the ocean, kind of beyond the borders of our territory. The barbarians, the savages. He's talking about the Gentiles. He's talking about the message, his message spreading out. The stump, this branch coming out of the stump of Jesse. It's going to bear fruit that will bring healing to the islands. It's happened. That's true. The stump of Jesse was cut down. The tree of Jesse was cut down, and this branch grew, and now all of us are eating the fruit thousands of years later. Beautiful stuff. And it says, God will make him a covenant for the people of Israel and a light for the nations. Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say God will use him to fulfill the covenant. It says God will make him to be a covenant. In other words, a new covenant. Why? Because Israel, you've broken the old one. The old one is null and void. The one that promised God's protection and blessing in return for your obedience, you have nullified it so many times that it cannot be remade. The only way this can change is for somebody to step in and himself become a new covenant on your behalf. Now, how does that work? It's our last passage. You ready? Everybody with me so far? Isaiah 53. Who has believed our message? and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. But surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. And the punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we're healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. Famous words out of Isaiah 53, right? And notice again how it starts. He grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. So fascinating of an image, again, to describe Jesus, isn't it? The world is this desolate, dry desert. And how would you expect God to deal with this desolate, dry desert? Thunderstorm, right? Like this torrential downpour that's going to come and soak the whole thing and regrow a whole new forest. What does God do instead? Just a little shoot poking up out of the ground that seems lowly and humble, that seems quiet and simple, that seems fragile, but really is hope. You guys remember that movie Wall-E? Such a great film. I want to watch it today. I was thinking about it today, and I was like, I have to see it again. But you're in this like garbage dump of a world where everything has been destroyed, and Wall-E finds this little tiny plant hiding inside a broken down refrigerator. And that becomes the impetus for the entire film, for the entire movie, for the restoration of the world. Life is possible here. There's a shoot coming up out of the ground. That's the picture we have. Dry ground, this little shoot forming that shows hope. But when you look at it, it seems like nothing. As a matter of fact, not just humble and lowly, but despised and rejected. It's not just that we look at it and say, oh, isn't that nice? It's that when people look at it, they turn away. That's the picture here. It says that Jesus has no stately form or majesty that we should be drawn to him. Again, he doesn't show up with any of the trappings of power that we would expect. He's not, according to this text, physically attractive. He's not politically attractive. He does nothing to try to ingratiate himself to those in power. Instead, he uses all of his influence and his charisma, and he wastes it on the poor and the oppressed, giving them all of his attention and ignoring the powerful and influential. And because of that, they hated him. Those in power hated him. They turned their power against him and ended up causing him pain. It says he was a man of suffering, familiar with pain. And you think about that and you're like, why? He didn't do anything wrong. Why would he be familiar with pain? Why would he be a man of grief and sorrow? And the answer becomes clear. It's because he took up the pain of those that were not his. It wasn't his pain to take up. He identified himself with the broken and the hurting. And he bore their pain and our suffering. He stepped between the consequence and the person who deserved it. And he suffered on their behalf. He was a man, in other words, of compassion. I just realized recently that the word compassion, it's a compound Latin word, right? The word passion in Latin means what? Suffering. Right? That's what the passion of Christ is. Passion of Christ is the suffering of Christ. And calm, C-O-M, like community, what does that mean? With. So what does compassion mean? Suffering with. He's a man of compassion who suffers with those who suffer, who steps between the consequences and the person who deserves it. It's not his wrongdoing, it's ours that causes the suffering. And by stepping between us and it, he brings restoration and wholeness. How? And the answer is forgiveness. He forgives us our wrongdoing. That's how he becomes the covenant. Okay, because we've seen these covenant agreements in the Old Testament just get broken over and over and over again by our idolatry and our hardened hearts, and nothing, no amount of law, no amount of rule, no amount of restriction or thou shalt nots will change this. We just keep on doing the same stuff. The only thing that can change our character, that can change our heart, is mercy. When somebody steps in and says, I know you deserve this, but I'm going to take it for you. That's the only thing that will ultimately change a heart. And that's how he becomes the covenant. He comes in and he covers over. Actually, that's a terrible way of saying it. He deals with the penalty of our sin by taking it himself. Because that's what forgiveness means. You guys have heard me talk about this before. Forgiveness doesn't mean covering over. It doesn't mean just wiping off a slate. If somebody incurs a debt against you, if someone owes you money and they come to you and they say, hey, I can't pay you back, and you say, it's okay, I'll take care of it. What are you saying? I will pay for it for you. It's not that there's suddenly no concept of money. It's not that money doesn't mean anything. It's that you are choosing to pay that debt on their behalf. You're choosing not to get paid back the money that you're rightly owed, which means that money came out of your pocket and you're never going to get it back. The same is true relationally. When somebody hurts us and we choose to forgive them, what we're saying is, rather than hold it against you and seek vengeance against you, I am choosing to release you of your obligation, and that means I have to take all the pain myself so you can be free. That's how forgiveness works. There's no such thing as just forget it. That doesn't happen. Forgiveness means that the one who's doing the forgiving has to suffer for the one who did the hurting. And that's what Jesus does. That's how he becomes a covenant. Remember, we talked about Abraham walking between the halves, or God walking between the halves of the bowls and guaranteeing both halves of the covenant himself. He guarantees the blessing and prosperity by guaranteeing forgiveness for those who have fallen short. And so, he gets what we deserve, and we get what he deserves. And that's the gospel message. And Isaiah, I don't even think he realized it. He probably didn't even realize it until he died and got to sit in front of Jesus and be like, oh my gosh, I get it now. You know, I was thinking about today when I was reading this, I was thinking about that verse that says, I'm going to get it wrong, but basically the angels long to look into the things that we know. You remember that? Or I was thinking about on the Mount of Transfiguration when Jesus was talking to Moses and Elijah, and it says he was telling them what was about to happen. Christians, I don't know if you realize the gift that we have of being on this side, on the New Testament side of things, where we actually know what this is talking about. Because if you didn't have the New Testament, you didn't know who Jesus was, I'll tell you what, those 3 passages I read, you wouldn't think they were the same person. You might not have any. How is it possible that the Isaiah 9 mighty God, wonderful counselor could also be the Isaiah 53 suffering servant? You would have no idea. But then Jesus comes along and he suffers and he dies, and more than that, he's raised to life. Because that's the other problem, is you read these passages about God being with him and protecting him and about him reigning forever, and then he died. But the resurrection vindicates him, and it makes it possible for him to be all of these characters all at once. And suddenly we see him, and he unlocks the whole story for us. I think about Paul in those 3 days after he met Jesus on the road to Damascus when he was blinded, and he wasn't eating or drinking anything. I think he must have just been running through the whole Old Testament, because he probably had the whole thing memorized. Just running through it in his mind as Jesus was like going off like a firework everywhere and just setting the whole thing alive. Things were unlocking that he never understood before. And suddenly, all the broken pieces, all the fragments of the story fit together around this character. And you realize that the whole thing was orbiting around him the entire time. We just didn't know it. That he was the center of our broken story. And he makes sense of the whole thing. That's what happened with Philip and the Ethiopian in the book of Acts. He was reading Isaiah 53. He had no idea what he was reading And Philip comes running up alongside him. Hey, what are you reading? And he says, Isaiah 53, but I don't get it. And what does Philip do? Tells him about Jesus. And the whole thing clicks together. His whole story makes sense to the point that he says, I want to follow this Jesus. And the same is true for you too. I'm guessing at some point, I look around the room, I think everybody in this room is a follower of Jesus, which means at some point you encountered him and the broken pieces of your life fit together around him. And he made sense and continues to make sense of all of it. He is the gravitational pull that holds you together. We cannot read the Old Testament without him. Cannot understand the prophets without him. And these pictures that Isaiah gives us, these messianic prophecies, man, just change everything. It was this game of try harder, repent, turn around, and now it's grace that transforms. It's compassion that brings us to repentance and enables us to be completely different. Let's pray.